Hi, everyone. Reading has entertained me and helped me through life's ups and downs for as long as I can remember. It's a special moment in a bookworm's life, though, when a book transcends being just a good read and strikes a chord in a very personal way. Rebecca Makkai's latest novel, The Great Believers, is a dazzling story of friendship and redemption in the face of tragedy and loss during the height of the Aids epidemic in 1980 Chicago and contemporary Paris. It is the winner of, get ready, Andrew Carnegie Medal for Fiction, winner of the Stonewall Book Award and LA Times Book Prize, finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, shortlisted for the National Book Award, selected as one of the New York Times Best 10 Books of the Year in 2018, a Washington Post Notable Book, a BuzzFeed Book of the Year, a pick for the New York Library's Best Books of the Year, as well as a Best Book of 2018 in my own section of N Magazine. I'm a great believer in the power of fiction to tell the truth. Makkai's novel is a story that left me stunned with its ability to tell the truth of a time so rarely spoken, read, or written about. As a gay man in 2019, I have lived a much different life than these characters in 1980 Chicago, but I see myself in this story. It could have very easily been me and my friends. I never try to take that for granted. The book also lit a fire under me and propelled me to have a voice for all those victims dying alone in their beds with AIDS who didn't have a voice or support. Because of them, my life is infinitely better, and for that I thank them. Close up on Rebecca. She is the Chicago-based author of the aforementioned The Great Believers, The 100-Year House, The Borrower, and Music for Wartime. She is on the MFA faculties of Sierra Nevada College and Northwestern University, and she is the artistic director of Storio Studio Chicago. She has 2 young daughters, holds an MA in literature from Middlebury College's Breadloaf School of English, and I could not be more thrilled to welcome her here to the Nantucket Book Festival. I would also like to add that it can be a gamble to meet an author whose book you adore, but we hung out all last night and we're practically besties now, so she is as fabulous as her book. Please join me in applauding Rebecca Makkai. Hello.
Hey.
So, Stonewall Book Award, LA Times Book Prize, finalist for the Pulitzer. Mm-hmm. Why do you think this book resonated with critics and readers?
That's a great question. I don't, because you always hope that that's every book, right? Like, it's not like I was like, well, this time I'm going to write one that people really like. You're always trying to do that. You're always trying to get at something real. I think that I felt like a much more mature writer as I was working on this one than on my previous books. So there's that. But in terms of the subject matter, I think that we are at a time when that era of, the sort of the height of the American AIDS epidemic, although it's an ongoing epidemic, is being largely forgotten. I'm really worried that we're returning to some of the silence that first surrounded it for very complicated reasons. And I think that for some people, it's been a reminder of things they already knew. For some people, it's been news, whether it's that they were too young to remember or that they were around, but they just, the media didn't do a good job of filling people in. If you didn't happen to live in in the city, if you didn't happen to have friends that were immediately affected by it, a lot of people just were unaware. So I think there's a bit of that. And I think that, I really have learned that the only thing that really sells books is word of mouth. You can get great reviews, word of mouth and NPR, but mostly word of mouth. And I think that there are certain books that for some reason you read and you enjoy them and you're fine. And there are other books you read and you really want to tell people about them and you want to make them read it. And maybe because this is a book about friends, maybe because it puts people in that mind frame thinking about their own support networks, their own communities, maybe that's part of it. Or, people have learned something and they want other people to know it too. I don't know, but I'm thrilled. And seriously, the word of mouth, my other books have gotten good reviews, but there's something a little bit. Someone was interviewing me on stage, and he was like, "It's like that movie, The Ring. Like whoever watches it, then you have to pass it on to someone else." I was like, "That's a really alarming analogy," but thank you. So.
I mean, and I know why it resonated with me, and I said in the introduction, I lived such a different life than they did. What would you say to like someone my generation or younger that doesn't even know this story, like especially gay youth, and that they don't even know that this happened, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if they're talking to me, it's probably because they read my book. So, that these are conversations I've been having. People have come to events and then said, I have no idea. Or something I've been really honored by has been a number of times an older gay man will ask me to sign a book to a younger gay friend. Someone who did live through it is asking me to sign it for someone who didn't. And that is beyond my, what my wildest hopes were for this book. But yeah, no, I would say that, these are battles that were fought for all of us. The changes in, the lessons that we've learned, if we have indeed learned them, and the changes that were made, if we can indeed sustain the changes that were made, in, the very hard-earned victories in fights against, health insurance issues, against, the ignorance of the media, of the government. Those are victories we're holding on to, just by the edge. And I think it's so important for all of us to understand, people were out there fighting in the streets. They weren't, they were fighting knowing that they had no chance often of survival. They were fighting knowing they had weeks to live. They were fighting for everyone. I mean, certainly it was against this disease. It was for their immediate friends, but they were necessarily fighting for the future. They were beyond hope of rescuing themselves.
So the book is fictional, but obviously based on fact. Can you tell us about your research? And
yeah.
I'd really love to know some hopeful stories out of it, as opposed to just the ones of like that make you want to cry.
I know. No, and I did find a lot of that hope. Partly, of course, because I was talking to survivors, obviously. So there's that. But no. So what at the point where I realized what I was writing, I was really terrified for several reasons. One of which was, I'm writing across demographic difference, also across generational difference, which on the practical level was the biggest challenge for me. Just things that I was alive in the 80s, but I was a kid, and my parents were sadly not taking me to gay bars when I was 7 years old. So, there were some jumps that I had to be made there. But I realized that, first of all, what happened was I went to the major library downtown in Chicago, and I thought, okay, I know that these books are going to be boring, but I'm going to find all the like big nonfiction, the like someone's doctoral dissertation turned into a book, whatever, about AIDS in Chicago. 0 books about AIDS in Chicago, in America's 3rd largest city. There are some, it's not that there's nothing out there. I don't want to misrepresent it. There's some like chapters of like Out and Proud in the Windy City, which is a great coffee table book, has a couple of chapters. But, in terms of, I thought, I was like, they'll get some stuff that was published in the 80s, some stuff that's been published more recently, nothing. And I spent 5 years looking and asking everyone who would know. There's nothing. Chicago isn't even in the index of some of the really important books we have about the AIDS crisis as a whole, like How to Survive a Plague by David France. It's a really important book. Chicago's not even in the index. And I would bet that Boston isn't either. It's the stories that tend to get told are New York and San Francisco. And those aren't told often enough. But when we tell those stories, that's the stories we tell. Anyway, I realized, if I was going to research this, and I really did want to keep it in Chicago, I was going to need to do, I did manage a lot of archival research. The Windy City Times, which is Chicago's biggest gay weekly, started in the fall of '85, which happens to be when my story starts. So I read every back issue from '85 to '92, which was kind of a wild ride. And then I did a lot of interviews. So I started off just putting out on Facebook, like, does anyone want to talk to me? And originally, the first people I talked to, it might have been someone who moved to the city in '92, but worked for ACT UP, but had some information, but wasn't quite, the people at the core of this that I was looking for. But at the end of every interview, I said, who are the next 3 people I should talk to? And then they were making those introductions and vouching for me. So I ended up talking to doctors, nurses, lawyers, journalists, historians, activists, the art therapist at Illinois Masonic Hospital, survivors, people who've been living with HIV since the early 80s, which is hard to find. And a couple of them sat down with me. I could never have written this book without those people. And then without several of them reading it in manuscript form, to tell me, when little things were off. But their fingerprints are all over this. And you said hopeful stories. I mean, I was not ready. I didn't understand. Okay. I was preparing to write about how horribly everyone was treated in the hospitals. Because those are often the stories you hear. And I had no idea that Chicago, at Illinois Masonic Hospital, we had one of the first dedicated AIDS units in the world. And these amazing doctors and nurses. And like I said, there's an art therapy room, there's a lounge, there was a smoking deck because it was the 80s. Doesn't seem like a great idea in retrospect, but people would come in and like different restaurants would donate food every night of the week. These two barbers would come in and cut people's hair. There were massage therapists who volunteered their time. And it genuinely was a really beautiful place. It's defunct now as an AIDS unit. We don't need a dedicated inpatient AIDS unit. But I went up. It's all these rooms are like, it's like storage now. This one kind of unit of the hospital. But I went up and I wrote the sections that are set there. I wrote them on a bench in that unit with like the lights halfway off. But I was so amazed hearing about a place where things worked. Where there was just so much love and care in that unit. And the dedication and oh my God, separately from that, these badass activists that I got to meet, whose voices honestly have gotten me through the last 3 years politically in this country. But like the guys, like I have this chapter laid in the book of this 1990 ACT UP demonstration in Chicago. These 5 guys get out on this ledge of the county building and then they're dragged back in. One of them sat down with me. There were 2 survivors among those 5 men. He sat down and talked with me and he was amazing. He'd been a hairdresser and then he became this amazing activist. And now he's a hairdresser again. I guess he was always a hairdresser, but he's like, I speak on panels once in a while, but that's mostly, behind me. And you'd never know. You would get your hair cut from this person and you have no idea that you're talking to Paul Revere, to me, honestly, I know I'm saying that in New England, it's probably blasphemy, but someone who
a gay man's Paul Revere.
A gay man's Paul Revere. I've been studying this person as a historical person and as a hero, and he's sitting there talking to me, and nobody knows who he is, Yeah.
So let's talk about the title, because it comes from an F. Scott Fitzgerald quote that I just love. We were the great believers. I have never cared for any men as much as for these who felt the first springs when I did, and saw death ahead, and were reprieved, and who now walk the long, stormy summer.
Yeah, I found that quote really early in the process. I was really, there's a subplot in the book of this woman who'd been an artist's muse in World War I era Paris. And I really thought the book was originally going to be much more about her. And Yale was maybe my subplot, and then everything went awry. But I was, because it was taking me so long to find the AIDS research, it's really easy to find Art World Paris stuff, endless books and biographies. And I was reading this wonderful book called Flappers, 6 Women of a Dangerous Generation by Judith McCrell. And it's each chapter is a different woman. It's Isadora Duncan and Zelda Fitzgerald. And she has this quote in there of Fitzgerald saying, "We were the great believers," just that part. And I was like, that's weird, because that's not what we think of that very jaded generation. And so I found the whole essay that it was from, and really what he was talking about was before the war, their sense of belief in American destiny and their greatness as soldiers. And I started really thinking about this generation. I was learning a lot about the visual artists who went to Paris before World War I. It was the age of the Art Academy. And so people were coming from everywhere, all over Europe. Fujita, who's in my book, coming from Japan. They're living in hovels. They're burning furniture for warmth. They're finding chosen family. They're making art. They're living in this city. And then the war and the influenza of 1918 roll through and decimate that generation largely of its young, able-bodied men. And it's in the aftermath of that the American writers we know go to Paris And that's when Gertrude Stein says to Hemingway, "You are all a lost generation." And that contrast between the great believers who went into this and the lost generation who lived the rest of their lives in aftermath. The parallels there, I don't need to spell it out for you, but the parallels there for me between that generation and the AIDS generation of a city like Chicago, where people were coming from all over and then this happened, they were really striking. And I felt like I found the core of my book, and I felt like that was the title. It's funny, my joke is that I'm trying to trick everyone into thinking it's a Bible study guide with the stripies and the font and the title, but so.
That's a perfect segue into not the Bible.
Now we shall read from 2nd Ephesians.
So the parallels you paint with war and AIDS is something that I found so amazing in the book. And in my advertising for this event, I wrote, in 1990, nearly twice as many Americans died of AIDS as died in the Vietnam War. I got 2 messages on Instagram from someone that said, "How dare I compare the two?" Why is it it is comparable.
And I've gotten that too. I've spoken, it was specifically, I got someone, it's again, someone who hadn't read the book, which is probably what you're getting. I had something like, someone had heard me on NPR, and I was talking about, this comparison, and she just found a random Instagram post of mine and was like, "I just heard you on NPR, and that's awfully rich," and blah, But no, I think, if we look, I'm looking, and I'm specifically in the context that I was speaking about on the radio, I was talking about activists. So I think there are 2 sides of this. There's, there are the people who, there's the side of it that's like war in that you are young, you are watching, you've become much tighter with your compatriots probably than with your nuclear family. And you are watching them all die, not knowing if you are next. And it is trauma after trauma after trauma. That's, it's trench warfare. I mean, there's less loud bangs, but other than that, like it's, in terms of that experience, in terms of the PTSD, in terms of living in aftermath, what happens to you when you see that many friends die when you're that young and you're spared and you don't know why? What happens when you thought, you were handed a death sentence? You thought you had weeks or moments to live, and you're still here 30 years later. And that's something that veterans deal with. In terms of, the activism, I see it as a different part of this. The protests, the demonstrations, the work that was done, which was really slowly but surely effective. AZT, when it came on the market, was the most expensive drug basically ever introduced. It was something like $700 a pill. And for no good reason. And you have people, Peter Staley, who is he's not in my book, he's just a hero of mine. He's a lawyer. He risked everything to come out, realizing he's giving up probably the rest of his law career, what it looked like at the time, to fight this fight, along with many, many other people. And they get the price lowered. The ACT UP demonstration that I was talking about in the book a minute ago in 1990, they really brought Mayor Daley of Chicago kind of 180 degrees slowly. But the immediate aftermath of that protest, they got 15 women's beds added to the AIDS unit at Cook County Hospital within 2 days. It worked. And they were out there, they were in the streets. They are being assaulted. Like the video footage that I've seen of these protests, the police would put on latex gloves so they wouldn't have to touch these people. But then they are throwing them on the pavement. They are, like, if you've read that chapter, the stuff with the horses, right? Like, that's all, you can watch. It's a weird thing to watch, but you can watch this protest on YouTube. Someone had a camcorder in the streets, and the footage is online. And they were out there, they were sick, they were injured, they did not have the energy to do this, they were fighting for their lives. And they were, they were risking death, they were risking physical injury, they were fighting for their lost friends, they were fighting for the friends who weren't yet lost. That's war. And that, we have benefited from that. Some of us more directly than others, but in the same way that, if someone goes and fights for my freedom by fighting some war in, South America, I'm sure that in some ways, it's easier for me to see how that fight is fought for us than some actual wars we've engaged in. And some actual wars, yeah, no, I get it. But this is for us. This is for all of us, and it's for, and it was fought by people who had both nothing to lose and everything to lose.
So you mentioned trauma, and Fiona is another fascinating character to me, and it dives. The book dives into parenthood and even touches, and there's a lot of big words here, so I have to read off of it. Transgenerational inheritance due to trauma, or epigenetic inheritance, meaning like through the placenta, the baby would get the trauma from the mother. And what type of mother did you see Fiona, and was that happening to her? And is that what had, her relationship with her daughter?
Yeah, that's basically, Fiona's thread. So Fiona, if you haven't read the book, she's in her 20s in the 1980s sections. Her brother's memorial service starts the book. But then every other chapter is her in 2015 Paris. And they're much thinner chapters. They're much smaller. I didn't want to create something that would try to vie for attention with the 1980s. But she's basically, living in aftermath in many ways, reconnecting with some old friends and finally having to deal with some of this stuff. And a lot of that has to do with how it's affected her other relationships. Her romantic relationships, certainly, but she can live without those, but also her relationship with her daughter, who was born right in the thick of all this. And I was really interested. It's funny because it's really the first thing I've written about parenthood. My oldest kid is 11, so I've been, living as a parent for a while, and this is the first. And of course, it comes out in my book about gay men. As the place where I'm going to write about motherhood for some, But she basically. I think you said it really well. I think there's, This is something I wanted to get to at the sort of the psychological aftershocks of this that aren't necessarily tangible. People aren't healed. People aren't walking around necessarily whole again, even if they weren't, even if they are not living with HIV. If you lived through that intimately, what has that done to you? And for some people, there's a lot of strength that's come from that. And I think that's true for Fiona. I think she's a stronger person, but she's really fundamentally flawed. It was also very important to me as I introduced a straight point of view character that she not be a straight savior, that she not be someone who swoops in and does only good. It was important that she be very, very flawed, just for her to work within the book. And she was fun to write. It's fun to write a very flawed person.
So all the different things, it's cults, parenthood, AIDS. How did it all come together? There's so many different things.
This is where someone's like, how did you get the idea for the book? Like there's one idea, right? And you're like, oh, I sat there and I had the whole book about AIDS and 1920s Paris and cults and whatever come to me all at once. Like, it's not, it really started being about Nora. My original thing was I was going to write, this from the end of this woman's life, looking back at this time as an artist model, and just mathematically that put her in the 80s. And then I was like, okay, this is an opportunity to write about the AIDS epidemic, which is something I've written about before and something I really wanted to, write more about. My initial thing was I was going to have this woman watching TV, and a painting would come on the news. And it's like dubious authenticity. Like, is this by this famous artist or not? And nobody knows, but she knows because it's a painting of her. And she's like going to get in touch with people and then like tell her story. And I have been thinking about this for a really long time. And then I was getting ready to leave for an artist residency. And my husband was like, well, what are you going to work on? And I told him. And he really gently goes, honey, that's the plot of the movie Titanic. She's she's watching there's like a sketch that they pull up and she's like, that's me, and so that was a big moment of rethinking things for me. But ultimately, I like writing books that are about.
I love Titanic.
Oh well, yeah. I basically just rewrite Titanic. I love writing books that are about lots of different things. I think that so often, if you just go into a book with one idea and you try to push that idea forward, you run out of steam, and it's the story people have read before. And for me, when I go in, whether it's a novel or a short story, when I go in with multiple ideas that I don't even know yet what they have to do with each other, they start playing off each other in really interesting ways. And the meanings of the book, lie in that space between them? You know, what's the space between cults and chosen family and religion and, you know, faith in various other things and community? And, you know, that's where it's not my job to, thank God, write the 11th grade English paper on this, but that's where, you know, that's where you could find that stuff.
Yeah. After you were finished writing it and editing it, what did you learn from your own book? Like, what did you take away from it?
I definitely became more politically active and brave in writing this. I've always been a political person, but it is that like, oh, I'm just going to sit here and like not canvas, you know, like when people were out there fighting in the streets. So that changed a lot for me. And just the fact, learning how much that direct action works, which I don't think I'd really understood, you know, like, oh, we're out here protesting, it's not going to do anything. It really can. So there's that. I think I think certainly it made me a better human writing this book. It's not like I went in, you know, evil and came out good, but I don't think. You know, you live in this world. I was writing this for 4 or 5 years, you know, and I'm living in a world of, you know, kind of deep empathy, not only for my characters, but for, you know, of course, the people I was talking to and listening. I sort of ended up in almost a therapist role for a lot of the people I talked to. I was asking them things they hadn't been asked in a very long time. Sometimes it was because I was asking them very weird questions, like, what color was the carpet? And they're like, oh, like, you know, bringing things back for them. And those conversations and those ongoing relationships, I think certainly just taught me a lot. I don't know, one of the most amazing things that I heard as I was writing this was, there was a playwright in Chicago who died of AIDS. His name was Scott McPherson. He wrote this play called Marvin's Room that recently had a revival on Broadway or just off Broadway. And it's about it's about someone dying of cancer. He was sort of writing something analogous to his own experience as he was sick. And but it was only at the beginning of his illness. And at the end of his life, a friend of his who was talking to me said, he was, you know, like, this is the very end of his life. And he was like, you know what I'm really proud of? It was like, when I wrote that play, I didn't know what death was like. And it turns out I was right. And, death is not something that anyone who's been through it has ever written about, if you think about it, right? And this is in many ways, those of you who haven't read it, don't be afraid. It's not all doom. It's not all death. There's a lot of light. There's a lot of hope in this book. But I am fundamentally writing about death in a way. And it, you know, most of us don't sit around for 4 years dwelling on death that intensely. And I think that, you know, we'll have to wait and I'll find out eventually. But I think that changed me a lot.
We only have 5 more minutes, so I have 2 other quick questions. And then we'll hopefully read. Yeah. I heard that Amy Poehler is adapting The Great Believers for television. Can you share any details? And do you have a dream cast?
Yeah. Okay. So here's the deal. This is without getting into all the nitty gritty of Hollywood. Her production company, Paper Kite Productions, has optioned it, which means we get to now kind of put together a package that in the fall she's going to go to networks with. And the idea is limited series, you know, Hulu, Netflix, Showtime, HBO kind of thing, 8 or 10 episodes, which I think is, this is a saga, and I never wanted it to be a movie and try to squeeze this in 2 hours. I'll stay involved creatively, I can say that, although what that will look like depends on the eventual contract with a network. And it will stay in Chicago. Not necessarily be filmed there entirely, but I was not interested in this being set in San Francisco. Like, we need to make that show too. This one's about Chicago. And so there's that. Yeah, the Dreamcast, I want to steal like most of the cast of Looking. Did you watch Looking on HBO? It was like Jonathan Groff and Russell Tovey. Yeah, I want to steal a lot of them. And then there's this really sweet Australian actor named Harry Cook who like started just like tweeting at me. Like, he's just like really likes the book. And I was like, oh, you'd be great for like yeah. So
if Amy needs to talk to me,
I mean,
just like,
you know, it's fun. I did get to have dinner with her a couple weeks ago. It was really, really a blast.
Hilarious?
Yeah. Yeah, she's a very generous laugher, which is really nice because like she's genuinely funny and I'm making stupid jokes and she's laughing like I said the funniest thing, which is like great.
Like walk away and you're like, I'm funny.
I know, right? Like, oh shoot.
Okay, quick speed round and then we'll get to your reading.
Okay.
So favorite book as a kid?
The Westing Game by Ellen Raskin.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Book that made you cry the hardest?
This is really embarrassing because it was in college and my taste wasn't that good and it was just like kind of but it was Angela's Ashes. By Frank McCourt. It's not, I would have loved to say like.
I thought you were going to say The Notebook.
Oh, no. It's not that embarrassing. Come on. No.
Book that made you laugh the loudest?
That would probably be, actually as a kid, I was so in love with Lois Lowry, who's a genuinely funny writer, and the Anastasia Krupnik books, and I would read them aloud to my mother, hoping she would laugh as hard as I was laughing, and she was like, okay. And I just thought they genuinely are very, very funny. Yeah.
Favorite book with LGBT plus characters?
That's, okay, can I say Angels in America?
You can.
I really deeply love Angels in America, and it was a huge influence on this book. And I like really studied it in grad school and kind of like lived deeply in that play.
The play?
Not the original cast, but I've seen.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I've seen. Yeah. I've seen it.
Favorite mystery?
Favorite mystery. The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Yeah.
Is there a book you wish you had written?
Yes. Yeah, a lot of them. I think I'm most jealous when it's something that I would never write because it's so different. The Virgins by Pamela Aarons. It was like a small press book a few years ago. It's a boarding school novel. You like boarding school novels. You have to read it. The Virgins.
Write that down.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what are you working on right now?
Okay, so we were talking about this at brunch. I've lived on campus at the boarding school where my husband teaches for the past 17 years, and I'm finally writing a boarding school novel. But it's not told from the point of view of a teenager, so mostly. So
I said at brunch, I need that book right now.
Yeah. It's like true crime boarding school. What I'm telling people is it's like the first season of Serial meets The Big Chill, meets The Hotel New Hampshire, meets Lysistrata.
Get working. Okay, if you wouldn't mind reading, we'd love it.
Okay. So what I'm going to read, I got really, really tired of reading the things that I was usually reading on the road. And since it is June, it's Pride Month. And not only that, but it's, 50 years of Pride Month, 50 years since Stonewall. I'm reading very carefully with no spoilers, a section late in the book that's set at the 1986 Chicago Pride Parade. And what you need to know here, Yale is our main character. He's worried his friends are mad at him. Don't really worry about why. He's going to meet up with some friends. And one of the floats that's going to go by, he knows, is his friend Asher, who's a big deal lawyer. And he has this big burning crush on Asher that he's never going to do anything about. Harold Washington, first black mayor of Chicago. In fact, I think first black mayor of a major American city, who a lot of people would say was gay and in the closet. But no, that's unprovable. He was great on AIDS for an American mayor at that time. He's at the Pride Parade. He unfortunately died very suddenly in office right after that. And then we got a mayor who needed to be brought around and lost a lot of time. Anyway, okay. By the time he got to Clark, the route was packed and the first few floats had gone by. He wound his way behind people, looking for someone he recognized. After 2 blocks, he spotted Katsu Tatami across the street. And when a few people ran across behind the Anheuser-Busch float, he crossed too. He didn't know the guys Katsu was standing with, but Katsu was always good for a hug, an enthusiastic greeting. He had to shout in Yale's ear, "So far, so good. You want my soda?" He thrust a McDonald's cup at Yale, and a thought about germs flashed across Yale's mind, but he willfully ignored it. He took a sip and then wished he hadn't. Warm, flat sugar water. A bunch of Harleys rolled past, followed by a lesbian dojo, women kicking and chopping their way down the street, dressed in white. Miskay, Wisconsin. Earnest middle-aged women with P-flag signs, a huge brass bed pulled by a convertible and occupied by 2 men making out with tremendous gusto, their torsos bare above a thin white sheet. I should say my research on the 1986 Chicago Pride Parade was YouTube-based, and it was amazing. I had a lot of fun. Yale asked Katsu how he was, and Katsu said, "I'm becoming a legal expert." He shouted that he'd gotten new insurance 2 years ago. In January, he was feeling terrible and finally got tested. And he had it. Did Yale know? Yeah, son of a bitch. He hadn't even told his mom. And his goddamn insurance was trying to claim that the virus was a pre-existing condition so they wouldn't have to cover it. Even though I got the insurance before the fucking test came out, but they're claiming I should have known because 3 years ago I was treated for thrush 1 time, and that's enough for them to turn me down. He needed pentamidine treatments, and he'd need hospital care that wasn't at fucking County, where he'd been a couple times and was Yale aware what it smelled like in there. There was a reason it was free. So Asher was helping him apply for Social Security that he'd have to have before he could get Medicaid, because apparently that was how things worked in this stupid country. And do you know what we have to prove? Okay, this is insane. We have to prove I'm disabled, which I am now, because maybe I could work 4 days a week, but the 5th day I get the runs so bad I'm glued to the bathroom floor. This was tenable for his part-time gig at Howard Brown, but not for the administrative assistant work that used to pay the bills and supply the useless insurance. But the runs aren't a disability category, right? So Asher's finding me this junior litigator, and here's what he has to prove at this hearing. He has to show that I can't do any unskilled sedentary labor in the national economy, like the entire nation. And the fucking examples they use, you want to hear the examples? Yale was exhausted just listening to Katsu, but sure, he wanted to hear. A drag queen passed on stilts in an elaborate Statue of Liberty costume, all green sparkles and gauze. I shit you not, nut sorter. That's not a euphemism, by the way. Bowling ball polisher, also not a euphemism. Silverware wrapper, like sitting there wrapping silverware in napkins. Everyone wants their spoons handled by a guy with the AIDS runs, right? Wafer topper. I don't even know what that means. The last one, for real, is fishhook inspector in Alaska. They don't care that I can't get to Alaska and I could never get this job. They care that it's a job in the national economy. So yeah, my survival now depends on my proving I can't top wafers. Here came a bunch of guys in leather, a poster that read "Bound Up with Pride." Some kind of garden club followed. But I'm going to get in on whatever clinical trials I can. And Asher's helping, Yale said. Yeah, Asher, he can sort my nuts whenever he wants, am I right? Yale felt his face catch fire. Oh, come on, you let him polish your bowling balls. Yale attempted a non-committal laugh. And here, ridiculously before he could properly recover, was Asher's AFC float. Here was Asher, waving like a politician. Yale waved, but he didn't catch Asher's eye. 3 guys on unicycles came next, cutoffs and denim vests. A series of aldermen and state senators in convertibles, most looking pained. Okay, so I'm going to skip. I'm going to read like one more little section, which is, it's later. He's with his friend Teddy now. Teddy is a little bit obnoxious. Okay. Yale found himself alone with Teddy in an endless line for food. They're over in the park now. Yale said, I hope we're still friends. I was mad at you, but it was temporary. I was judging you for being judgmental. Ironic, right? The line lurched, and Yale checked to make sure the guys behind them were strangers. He said, I feel like we're caught up in some huge cycle of judgment. We spent our whole lives unlearning it, and here we are. The thing is, Teddy said, the disease itself feels like a judgment. We've all got a little Jesse Helms on our shoulder, right? If you got it from sleeping with 1,000 guys, then it's a judgment on your promiscuity. If you got it from sleeping with one guy once, that's almost worse. It's like a judgment on all of us. Like the act itself is the problem and not the number of times you did it. And if you got it because you thought you couldn't, it's a judgment on your hubris. And if you got it because you knew you could and you didn't care, it's a judgment on how much you hate yourself. Isn't that why the world loves Ryan White so much? How could God have it out for some poor kid with a blood disorder? But then people are still being terrible. They're judging him just for being sick, not even the way he got it. Way over at the bandstand, Mayor Washington had begun to speak. As a black man who has suffered discrimination, he was saying, as part of a race of people who have suffered. And Teddy said, he's a good one, yeah, we lucked out. And I'll stop there.
So I think we have time for like 3 minutes for questions if anyone has any.
I'm sure they do. You just always need one person to ask the first question. That's really the thing.
Must have covered all of it.
Maybe.
Anyone?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So the question was like, I'm writing from outside this community and what drew me into it to begin with, basically. I think there is the like, I work in the arts in a major city. I have, infinite gay friends. I love them. They're my, a lot of my favorite people. So there's that. Beyond that, I will say that, so I was born in 1978. And when I talk to people right around exactly my age, they often have this immediate understanding of why I would write about this. For people a bit older, they had a sense of crises coming and going. This is the latest thing. They might have, they had, that learned sort of sense of that's happening to those people over there. I don't need to worry about it. People a bit younger missed it, weren't aware. People right around exactly my age, we saw it for what it was, which was the biggest thing happening in the world. It was the backdrop to my childhood, the way that the Vietnam War might have been the backdrop to a lot of American childhoods, right? Even if you didn't lose a cousin in it, it was there. And for me, it was just, I think for a lot of people in my generation, if we were paying attention, and, I lived, right near Chicago. So, it was part of that. My parents were in academia. They lost one friend, but it wasn't someone I knew particularly. But I was affected. My mother was very freaked out because she'd been carpooling across the country to a conference with this guy, and he had a cough. And he was like, I've been feeling a little under the weather. And a week later, he was dead. And this was really early. This is maybe like 83. And so that, things like that when you're a kid, you're like, oh, okay, this is super, super important. And just something that, as it came on the news, because as, kids used to watch the news. My kids don't watch the news, but I grew up watching the news every day. Or you stay homesick from school and you watch Donahue or whatever. And I paid attention, and I thought these men were wonderful. I didn't know, didn't realize yet that literally all of my male friends in elementary school would turn out gay. It was just like this genetic thing that I had. Like, I love it because my daughters totally have it too. Like all their sweet little friends, and I'm like, oh yeah. So there was just something, something that really spoke. So this has been kind of a lifelong interest and focus. But that doesn't mean that I was equipped to write about it. I could not have gone into this with any kind of hubris, any sense that I could just empathize my way there. I had to do so much legwork. And I had to really go in assuming that I knew nothing. Because it's simple mistakes that I would make that I just, one of the stories I'm always telling on myself is that in a very early draft of the book, I had Yale, so the first chapter, he's kind of lost track of his friends, and his next chapter, he's walking down North Halsted, which is where all the big strip of gay bars were and are, and he's looking for his friends, and he's looking in the windows. You cannot look in the window of a gay bar in 1985. And that's not something, that was more of a generational point of ignorance for me than anything else, actually. Because I say that to, younger gay men, and they're like, what? But I told that same story. I was reading in Provincetown 2 weekends ago, which was Pride Weekend in Provincetown, and it's this wonderful barn full of mostly like gay men in their 50s and 60s and 70s. And I say that they all just die laughing. Like they get it right away. And other crowds have to explain that. So yeah, I couldn't go in going, oh, I know that bar. I've been there. I get this. I can write about it. I would have made so many mistakes. So I had to come in with a healthy sense of terror and a lot of humility. So, yeah.
One more question?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is the readers that I said, people looked at it in manuscript form. No, there were 3 readers with whom I'd formed very close friendships in doing this. There's a woman who was a charge nurse at Illinois Masonic Hospital, who is queer herself. I really needed someone to read for the medical stuff. I was going to make some big mistakes otherwise. And then there were 2 men who'd both been out in the city during this time. One is a historian and bookseller, and the other is a lawyer and was an activist and was the one who gave me that real, by the way, list of jobs that he had to go into court again and again and prove people couldn't do, that they couldn't top wafers. I'd become very close with all 3 of them. And so really, said, please feel free to say no, but I would love for you to read this and let me know just anything that is inaccurate, anything you don't like, anything this doesn't feel authentic, anything that's, this doesn't feel like the way we would have said it. And I said, especially to the two men, I said, up to and including that you don't think I should publish this in its current form. If you think I need to overhaul this whole book, if I shouldn't be telling this story, if I'm really messing it up, I need you to tell me that. And they were all incredible. And those two men in particular, they were really reading everything, and helping me pick out, no, not that bar, do this bar. The floor was sticky, you have to mention that. And at one point, I'm sitting there across from Justin, he's the lawyer. We're sitting in a coffee shop, and he's got my manuscript, and he's going through, he's made notes, and he's going through page by page to find his notes for me. And about halfway through, he stops, and he goes, Rebecca, I just really don't think that you could walk east at that time of night and get a cheeseburger. And I was like, oh my God. You just murdered me, Justin. Oh my God. Because I was so waiting for that moment, and he was like, I think he needs to walk. It's But so I remain incredibly, incredibly grateful to those people. It's not something my editor could have done. My editor is a straight woman from England. It's just not, I had to do that. So that's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. This is going to be a highlight of my year. Thank you, everyone, for coming.